Welcome to our webinar today on designing for success during construction. We're going to talk about different ways to protect stormwater, your local water bodies, and prevent pollution from construction sites. Big shout out to the Washington Stormwater Center for hosting this webinar. We've been doing a series of webinars. This is actually the fourth one. It's the last one in our series. If you missed the others, all these webinars are recorded and they will be posted online on the Washington Stormwater Center website. So today we are your two presenters. Your first presenter is Jordan. Jordan moved to the Pacific Northwest from Florida, and he's experienced the private side of working as a consultant, and he is now a surface water utility engineer for the city of Kirkland. He has experience with capital projects, commercial and residential. I will be the second presenter. My name is Maddie, and I have spent the last 4 years inspecting construction sites in Vancouver, Washington, and I currently work in water resource protection. So I hope today's presentation helps guide you or inspire you to protect your own local waterways.
All right, thank you, Maddie, for that great introduction, and welcome everyone to our little webinar that we put together. Like Maddie said, feel free to type in questions. We'll get to them at the end, and if we don't, feel free to email us or myself. We'll definitely have contact information towards the end of our slides. Just to start off, I'd like to say I work with the city of Kirkland, and what I'm going to say really reflects my own opinions personally. It's not supposed to be a reflection of city of Kirkland specifically. So just wanted to state that right off. And we'll get right into it. Rules and regulations, designing your construction site for success. As a designer, it's really important to kind of have that perspective of working with your contractor and handing off effective stormwater pollution prevention plans and erosion sediment control plans to your contractor, as the cycle will, lead around a good business and good overall environmental outcomes. So first off, just a quick overview is sort of how I organize this presentation of how your project, why you need to care, why should your project care, what you need to do. And then I'll get into some more specifics, not focusing on a specific BMP or a, too detailed, but hopefully providing you a train of thought that will guide you to the right BMPs you will need when you're creating these erosion sediment control plans and your stormwater pollution prevention plans. And then I'll wrap up with some takeaways. So first off, just a nice friendly introduction of why should your project care? And I harp back to something I learned in school about the 3 pillars of sustainability, but I adapted it for this presentation in particular. And just to give a nice explanation of our acronyms in this friendly acronym world, we have ESC, erosion and sediment control. So the pillars of creation, which I have decided to do a little edit here to the pillars of sustainability, which is environmental, economic, and social. And this is how a lot of problems are, addressed in the environmental engineering world. That was my training and upbringing. And so I figured how can I best relate this to what we're going to discuss today. On the environmental side, a quick statistic would be that a construction site has an increase in load, either of sediment or pollution that comes off your site between 10 and 20 times the amount that you would have of runoff in a normal storm. So that is an important idea to keep in mind when you're creating your construction site and you're controlling for the for runoff and for sediment. Then we have the economic side of things. And of course, that's money, money, money. Construction site is a business, your development is a business, and all your stakeholders are involved in hopefully gaining profit for their business and for their community. And so why would we need to consider that? There's fines potentially from the agency that would be providing the permitting if a construction site is not buttoned up as it needs to be, potentially cost recovery if the agency or another third-party entity has to clean up from a construction site, and potentially additional review time. If myself, I am sometimes a reviewer of development permit plans with the city of Kirkland, particularly with stormwater, either permanent design or in these temporary erosion sediment control plans. You know, if there's something that I don't particularly find to be protecting the surrounding properties or a natural water body, I might have to make a comment on it, which could extend the review time to another submittal. And then finally, the social aspect, which is a lot of stakeholders will have their information, such as their logo or their contact information along the construction sites and on your vehicles. So it's, you know, it's important to understand that your construction site is a representation of the reputation of all the stakeholders involved. And it's important to remember that, you know, the general public knows more about your construction site than you think. So finally, that's, you know, a little emotional way to bring you into this presentation. But now, why does your project need to care? Really, what is really driving you to consider sediment and erosion control for your construction site? And that is the regulations behind it. And so to kind of kick off a nice little millennial reign into this presentation, it started from the top and now we're here. Definitely nowhere near on the radar of what Drake probably has in mind of where that song would go, but it's something that spoke to me, and that we have all these jurisdictions within the United States, starting from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency that created landmark laws such as the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act. And that, of course, trickles down to the states and then further to separate state agencies, potentially conservation districts, to the county, myself being in Western Washington with King County, and then Kirkland. And it's important to consider sometimes all of these different stakeholders that might be involved in your project and what rules and regulations they may have for erosion sediment control. And finally, why your project needs to care is that even little guys like the city of Kirkland, where I work, we have the ability to institute fines, cost recovery, and potentially stop work orders if your construction site is not following the correct best management practices to control for stormwater. And so it's not that we wish to halt your site. We don't want to be harsh, but we have to have a little bit of teeth in order to rein these in. And so as the designer, you can put your contractor on the best foot forward, the best path, by creating an effective plan for them to follow. And so that's where it comes in. What do you need to do as the designer? And anytime you should consider erosion and sediment on your site, be that permanent, but most likely in this state of construction, you should think SWP. And that's the catchphrase I want you to take away from this, is think SWP. If you think it could possibly have some impact on a property downstream, on a water body, that's where that information is going to go. It's going to go into that template that is either provided by the Department of Ecology, which our colleague Russell Betteridge covered in the last presentation, this last webinar of this series. And it could also be with the city or the county that might have information pertaining to the SWP, such as in the King County manual. From my perspective, there's a whole chapter on what you need to consider for your construction, and that's in Appendix D. And then the city of Kirkland might also have its own details. And again, coming from that perspective, but whether you're in Spokane on Eastern Washington and whether you're in the city of Vancouver, these are all items that you need to consider in your temporary and erosion sediment control plan. And finally, another little quick reminder that SWPPP, SWPPP, stands for Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan. And sometimes there's the acronyms change a little bit. Sometimes there's CSWP, which is what we use, and that's Construction Stormwater Pollution Prevention. And then we just say the word plan. So it's always a little different depending on what jurisdiction you may be designing in. And so where do you look for this information? Could it be in the code, the municipal code, or the zoning code? Could it be in the design manuals that I referenced, either King County or the Eastern Washington Stormwater Management Manual or the Western Washington Stormwater Management Manual? Are there specific project needs? Or are there even like conditions that we provide from the city specifically related to a development site? And so the answer to that really is all of the above, but you're really, again, you're putting your best foot forward by taking a look at all this information, and most jurisdictions have this laid out for you. For instance, in the city of Kirkland, again, we have what's called public works conditions for any of these types of permits that may be completed here in the city for development. And so looking at a specific example, number 51, there's a lot of conditions, but I'm looking here at number 51. I don't want you to read all this quite yet, but as soon as I see, TESC, if I do a control find, or if I just read through all my information that I mentioned before, these are the words that are going to be sticking out at me as a designer to say, I should prepare for this for when my contractor takes over this project, takes over this permit. It's out of my hands from the civil design standpoint. What do I need to consider? And in this, I'm looking right at the middle. I see BMPs. I'm seeing an amount that the city needs to consider. And so maybe that's an idea of, maybe my site needs a laydown area. Maybe my site needs to consider, of course, silt fence, but maybe it needs straw bales and straw wattles as well. This is what this city is requiring. How am I going to accommodate that for the contractor on the site? And so again, I'm looking at some quantifiable ideas here where there's a minimum, for example, a minimum of 6 straw bales, but maybe you need more than that. Maybe you need 10, maybe you need 20, maybe there's an additional acre. And when you see these numbers and you see your site deviating from these conditions, these set standards in these design manuals, that's when you should be thinking SWP. I should put those changes in the SWP. And so maybe, yeah, I understand what you're saying, but why? I'm a busy designer. Maybe not all this is going to get caught. Come on, you can't stop every speck of dust from going into the storm drain. I mean, really, why? And the idea is maybe don't exactly understand all of these different actions that you need to take, all the BMPs, but understand the reaction to it. And that really comes down, I think, to these 3 big components in TSC, which is turbidity, pH, and flow control on your construction site. So understand that if you're controlling for all these 3 items, that's your end game. Start from the end and work towards the start. Know you need to stop turbidity. Know you need to keep pH under control. Know you need to keep flow control at a proper level for the storm system. And so for this presentation, I'll just focus on turbidity and flow control. And so again, just going back to this idea of that jurisdictions sort of guide this information. It goes from the top down to a more localized level, but you might find information on turbidity within the Washington Administrative Code, the WAC. You might find it in the King County Manual, for example, or whatever your county manual is. And you might find it in the pre-approved plans or whatever your city's specific details in design manual might be. City of Seattle has a design manual. City of Redmond has what's called a stormwater technical notebook. Whatever the particular phrase may be, you should go and consider all of those and understand that if it's not in that specific local level, for instance, if it's not in the city, it's not covered, then you back up and you go to the county and you consider what they have. And if for whatever reason, it's not in the county or a higher district, you go to the state. And that's where you'll find information related to what your project site will need. So let's just take a look at an example. Let's look at a small site. I scrubbed some sensitive information from this high level view. It looks pretty good. I see some silt fence down here. I see some BMP control for future low impact development to prevent compaction. But there's a couple things I see off. And zooming in, I see that they're using an existing driveway for the construction entrance, which will not be adequate for equipment. And so the city of Kirkland, again, this is from my perspective at the city, we require that a engineered construction entrance is provided. And so that's a comment that I'm going to make as a reviewer. And that's a comment that's not going to slip by and just be done as a post revision. It's probably going to need to be resubmitted, which goes back to that idea of economics and making sure that there's costs, there's a cost associated to that and time for review. Here's another idea. So they are, that I came across. There's a BMP here, a future dry well. I see a contour that, and water goes downhill, at least in our application. And I'm thinking, all right, water's going this way. There's silt fence on the east side. But I'm also thinking in my head, what's over here? What's on the right side of this property? And well, there's more private property. I'm looking at the map, I'm understanding that, but this is the back of the site. And if you think that the contractor is always going to know right away to go and clean the silt fence out all the time with no additional control, maybe silt fence is enough, and sometimes it is. There are calculations in the manual that might cover that. However, in this case, I didn't find it to be enough. And I was able to support, some of those assertions by looking in the manual and understanding the slope and thinking this isn't enough, that you need to address this problem in the SWPPP. And so they came back and were able to resubmit this on a second review along with other comments, but they did some changes here. They added in a little interceptor swale, and they added a sediment trap, and they added our construction entrance that was required for the pre-approved plans. Now moving over here, they added the interceptor swale, which now will catch their runoff. Water is going to flow into the sediment trap. They've cited the equation that they're going to use. They've sized the sediment trap. They said if warranted, which is fine. It was a little bit contentious when I made these comments, but I have to say that reviewers such as myself are taking this very seriously these days. And this contingency makes me extremely happy. This is exactly what I want to see when I review a project. This screams contingency. It screams an effective erosion sediment control plan. Let's look at a quick big site. That was also a really cool project to work on. They had some good elements. Let's zoom in on the sediment tank here. They have an interceptor swale down at the bottom and a tank, but immediately, that's good. Check that off. Check that off. I understand where the runoff's going, but I'm looking downstream and I don't know where that water is disappearing. Maybe it's evaporating. I highly doubt it. So, but where's that water going? And you as the designer should think, where to now? The contractor is not going to figure that out. It's the civil designer. Maybe the contractor will figure it out, but that's honestly not their job all the time. It's you, the designer, to get that best foot forward. Here is the revised version of that erosion plan. They went in, they gave me a specific size, the amount of tanks required, a provided volume. Again, I love that information because that's what's going to go into any modeling, or, that's what the contractor is going to order, not just a blanket temporary sediment tank with no idea for the size. And maybe they might have an idea, but this is a designer's responsibility. There's also just an idea, another tidbit to say there's a dewatering location. And finally, there is an outlet now for that temporary erosion plan. They labeled what, they've sized their outfall again to the manual that the city adheres to. They've told me where someone can go and, determine what their turbidity levels are, because that is a rule that we need to be under a certain threshold. And they provided that last flow path, and they show that this is enough for dispersion. It's, this is exactly what I want to see on an erosion plan. Nothing crazier than this. And so, looking at that quick tip, where is your sampling location? Sometimes if there is a spill on the road or at another site, we need to trace that back. And if the pH isn't at the right level for aquatic life, and if turbidity is too high, which in our jurisdiction is over 25 NTUs, which is the measurement for turbidity, we're going to be imposing that changes need to be made or met, or those economic fines could find themselves at the project site, which will eventually trickle not just down, but will trickle up as if it's not designed properly. Finally, just to get a little technical with sediment tanks, I just want to share a quick example of what you're considering, and you're not just dropping in a rectangle on your AutoCAD. There, you are sizing a site, and it might be that you can think it's completely pervious, but the idea is it's compacted, it's eroded, and so you need to consider that it's not just this completely fully infiltrative site, that it's not pervious. We have sizing criteria within the manual, within the code for the city specifically, and maybe that might be the case for your city or county as well. But consider the 2-year or the 10-year storm, and using a 15-minute time step, you're essentially making a temporary detention tank. And then consider that overflow path. What if you just get more storm than you anticipated? And the idea is that, yeah, you might be designing in the summer, but there's always water out there. Maybe a water pipe gets bursts, and I've had that happen to me near a project site. Maybe something has groundwater that hadn't been considered, or maybe processed water that's being used on the site or a holding basin just happens to break. And you need to consider that, because that in itself is a mini storm, and it's all surface water in my eyes. So that information, again, little catchphrase, think SWPPP. Here's an example from a technical information report, a drainage report that I was provided. A lot of info. I'm going to zoom in on this really quick. They provided me a WWHM model. They showed me what the 2-year flow was. From there, they took that flow. They used this equation that's provided in the manual. They gave me what an equivalent surface area for a pond would be, and they converted that into what a Baker tank is. Now the contractor knows exactly what they need to do to protect themselves to the maximum extent feasible. And that contingency, again, maybe you're building in the summer, freak things happen, freak storms happen, freak instances happen with utility lines. You need to have that contingency, and you as the designer will put your contractor's best foot forward. That worst case scenario, it is your best friend. And that is what I look for. And increasingly, a lot of reviewers in different jurisdictions look for. We care about the environment just as much as, environmental influencers out there like Greta Thunberg. We really care. We don't want to halt your site, but we are paying attention to these things. And I know other design firms are understanding that we're taking this seriously as well. Your site will get wet. Remember that, even in the summer, it has that potential. So a quick takeaway, every site is unique. Go ahead and use your experience. Sometimes when you're filling out SWPPPs, people will write it's not applicable. I read that. And when I see not applicable and that's it, that's not cutting it for me. I need to see an explanation. If there have been red lines about a BMP on a previous submittal, don't just ignore them. Call your reviewer. We're more personable than we think. We'd love to talk to you about these things. But at the same time, don't throw spaghetti at the wall. I don't want to see a site with 15 Baker tanks on it. I want it to be very, very neat spaghetti. Yeah, I want to see something on the plate, but it's, it is an engineering project within itself. Not as important as the awesome building you're going to be creating, but it's just as important. One thing I always heard as an engineer working at a consulting firm was that you're at the mercy of your contractor. I don't think that's true. Contractors are extremely busy. They know their stuff. in and out from what they do, but they don't know everything. Put their best foot forward, design a good erosion sediment control plan, and put together a thorough, clean SWPPP that they can use, because those will likely be your partners for the rest of your career. And go ahead and visit more construction sites so that you're not out of your element. And even you as a designer can take a CECL course. It's really informative. It's a fun day out in the field. And finally, understanding that your SWPPP is alive. Usually as a designer, you kind of complete that first one, and after your permit's approved, you hand it in, but understand that you could either be brought back in. It might have a question from your contractor, or maybe in your jurisdiction, sometimes the contractor puts together the SWPPP, but if you as the designer understand that it could be adjusted, and maybe allow in your plan for that adjustment to occur. And that's where you would discuss alternative BMPs within that SWPPP template, that document. So I'll close out here. That's me, and that's my contact information, and I'll hand it over to Maddie. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Jordan. My name's Maddie Burke. I'm with the City of Vancouver, and I'm going to be talking about some of the best practices for when you're developing a site. So I'm talking about grading changes. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about how site conditions change, striving for more than the minimum, erosion control plan tips, and also specification tips. I'm going to talk about soil stabilization, planning for waste, having a backup plan, communicating with your contractor, and how design does not end when construction starts. So you as the designer are the expert from taking this site from the picture on the left and taking it, transforming it to the picture on the right, and your plans have that vision outlined. So during this presentation, I'm hoping that you'll start to consider some of the things that need to occur while the site looks like this. So they're turning a lot into a subdivision, and a lot of grading has to occur, a lot of soil moving during these stages. And I'm going to show some of the issues I saw with the site in particular during those grading changes. So the first one, you can see these orange highlighted ones on the left. You can see that there's sediment going onto the road. So the soils and the gravel is filling up with dirt, and this is being tracked out onto the road, and it actually went down the road like a couple blocks, and that's really bad. A street sweeper is not the fix-all for erosion and sediment control, and neither is silt fence, which I'll get into later. But yeah, you don't want to just say, oh, I'll call a street sweeper, no big deal. You want to prevent that sediment from getting onto the road in the first place. In this next picture in the middle, you can see that the site isn't surrounded in silt fence. They owned the neighboring road as a private road. So there wasn't any silt fence or construction fence set up. And construction vehicles were using this gravel patch to enter and exit the site instead of the certified construction access. And that is part of why sediment was getting onto the road. So you want to consider controlling site access. And then in this picture on the top, there was a witch's hat installed into this catch basin, but it's not being maintained. And you can see that concrete has gotten into the catch basin, and there's even a plant growing in the sediment buildup inside that witch's hat. So just including inlet protection to install once is not sufficient. This last photo here is a second part of the site where vehicles were using a non-approved access to enter and exit the site. So here are just some of the things to consider of what can be a problem with sediment leaving the site and with water resources being protected. So my first tip to you is to visit the site. Site conditions change, and visiting the site is a great way to get a visual on it. Especially if you can visit when it rains, that's fantastic. When you visit the site, you want to consider, where does the water go when it leaves the site? What areas have high erosion risk, and what needs to be protected? And I want you to consider where water goes not just once it leaves the site, but where it goes from there. Maybe there's a stormwater facility a block downhill, or just verify what catch basins are around the area, not just right next to the site. Google Maps is great. Street View is a fantastic resource, but it doesn't compete with visiting the site when you're evaluating the erosion risks. And then another thing is to consider the phases and how your site will change through the project. Often, if your site looks completely different between phases of the project, your BMPs will also change. So you should strive for more than the minimum. Putting silt fence around every single site is not the catch-all for erosion and sediment control. Every site is different, and putting a silt fence around the site is good for sediment and it is good for containing the site. It doesn't always handle erosion, so you should always assume that all your BMPs need to be site-specific and then apply the minimum. I also want you to consider where you place items on the plans, such as concrete washout and material storage areas. You want it somewhere that's accessible. Concrete washout, you want it to be somewhere where the concrete truck drivers will see it and be able to wash out their chute. But you also want it somewhere that's not prone to erosion. So you don't want all the rainwater from your site going into your concrete washout area. So below I have some photos where silt fence was not enough. So in this first photo, you can see that the site has eroded and buried the silt fence. This is now failing. We in the city of Vancouver change out our silt fence once it's 1/3 full. So the site eroded over it and it's actually crossing over parts of it. In the second project, the SWPPP and erosion control plan said that the site will infiltrate. And here you can see water building up at the silt fence, and that silt fence was not sufficient to hold in that water, and it water left the site and went onto the neighboring property and also the right of way. And this last site, you can see there's water building up pressure at the silt fence, and then it actually untrenched out the silt fence, and you can see turbid water leaving the site through this failed silt fence. So it's great, it's a fantastic tool, but it's not the catch-all for erosion and sediment control. So when you are creating an erosion control plan, here are some tips to keep in mind. You want to make your plan easy to read. You want to use a legend and not a lot of callouts. You don't want to cross your leaders, and you want to make sure each hatch stands out. If it looks confusing to you, it's definitely going to look confusing to your contractor. I know you want to combine your grading and erosion control plans to save money, but when they're separate and it's a separate plan sheet, it can make it much easier to read. And then Jordan mentioned this, you always want to use your local jurisdiction standard details. So these details do vary by jurisdiction. You don't want to guess. You don't want to say just because Clark County is really close to Vancouver, they're probably the same. You want to look and see what specific area you're working in and what standard details they require. And you will save time and money by applying these early into the design. And then another thing about local standard details is just because a BMP can't be met doesn't mean you should scrap it entirely. Just if there's not room for a 100-foot construction access, that doesn't mean you should avoid it when you could negotiate a 50-foot construction access. So consider how you can incorporate BMPs when those minimums can't quite be met at your site. So if you're writing specifications for erosion and sediment control, you want to plan that BMPs will be installed and maintained and replaced. In this picture on the right, the contractor was shoveling the sediment buildup at this inlet, and they were using that same whisker bar to protect the drain for months, and it looks terrible. The BMPs don't last forever. You can't keep emptying out the same witch's hat, so you have to plan that these BMPs will need to be replaced. Erosion sediment control BMPs are not a choice, so you're doing your contractor a favor if you're including these BMPs in the planning, because this accurately reflects the project timeline and the project costs. You definitely want to include additional gravel in the bid list. Gravel can fill up with sediment and needs to be replaced. You also want to include a street sweeper in the bid list. In the city of Vancouver, we require that a street sweeper comes at the end of every workday. So something I want you to consider while you're designing is soil stabilization. So here I have a chart for soil stabilization dates in Western Washington. So during October 1st to April 30th, you can only have soils exposed for 2 days. And that means that if you leave for the weekend or shutting down your site, all soils have to be covered. So a great way to take care of this is you want to grade sites so that areas that you won't really use can be stabilized early. And it's also great to grade your site in sections. So this picture on the left, they graded out the part of the site that's closer to us. They graveled it, so the soils are stabilized, and then they moved on to the next section. So they just don't have a whole site opened up with a big field of soil. In my experience as an inspector, all the best sites are promptly graveled. They're quickly graded and they gravel the entire site that will be paved. So you just don't have to worry about those soils later on, and then less sediment will get in the gravel. This picture shows an option for temporary soil stabilization, putting down straw. So if you don't want to do a permanent measure or you're going to continue to grade later, you can set down straw, and that particular BMP works for 30 days. Another great way you can help with pollution prevention from construction sites is to plan for waste. So you're required to do this as a designer if you're writing the SWP. Element 9 asks you to plan for waste. So this section should never say NA. There's always potential pollutants on every site. Check out Royce's presentation on element 9 as a part of this series. But there's lots of common pollutants on site. Anytime you have vehicles, there's a potential for oil spills or hydraulic fluid. There's always sediment, and there's typically concrete or saw cut slurry, just different things to consider. There's going to be waste on your site, so this section should never say NA. If you plan a different container or where different kinds of waste will go, the people on site will follow, and it will absolutely help make the site look cleaner. Whereas when there's no place to put metal or recycling, it's all just going to end up as a mess. Another thing you want to do is plan a location for oil and fuel handling. If you're doing on-site fueling, there's definitely a risk of spills. So you just want to plan a location where you can control a spill, and if there's a spill there, it won't be super serious and accessible to water bodies. So Jordan talked about this, the contingency, but you have to have a backup plan. So planned BMPs aren't always sufficient. So you can definitely in your SWP include an initial BMP and then have a backup BMP in case the first one is not working out. And BMPs always work better in combination. So it's great to combine a wheel wash with a construction access. Jordan also mentioned this with the sediment tank, but you always need to have a backup plan for dewatering if your current dewatering plan is that your site infiltrates. Maybe when you had the tests years ago in a dry season, the site did infiltrate, but if you end up with water on your site, if your contractor ends up with water on their site, they need to have a backup plan for how to get rid of the turbid water and properly release that without negatively impacting the stormwater system. And sediment tanks need to be sized and engineered. So this isn't just something that the contractor can on the fly dig a hole or choose a tank. This is something that you as the designer need to engineer for a backup plan. So the site below, they did all the BMPs according to their plan, and they had tried really hard to keep sediment on site. So in this first picture, when I showed up, you can see a lot of sediment on the road. They had a street sweeper running during this time to try and clean it, and there's still so much dirt on the road. They had a 200-foot construction access, which is much longer than substandard, to try and control this. So, they were putting in the effort. But then here you can see in the second picture, it ended up raining. And although they have the witch's hat in there, turbid water was discharged into a nearby stormwater pond. And so these contractors were required to clean out the catch basin, clean up the site, and they ended up pausing work for a while to get everything in order. So it's great to have a backup plan for when the BMPs listed aren't quite sufficient. So next, you need to communicate with your contractor. Your contractor has experience doing erosion and sediment control. Ask them about what their preferred BMPs are, if they have any idea about challenges that you might face on the site. See how your contractor wants to handle slopes, and also ask them about needs for utilizing their access. What's really common in the city of Vancouver is we only allow one construction access, but it might prove to have a safety issue or not have sufficient truck turnaround space. And in that case, we do allow exceptions. So that's something you want to talk about your contractor. And you also want to consider parking areas, because maybe you might need additional gravel or to construct a parking area early in the project so that the crew can access the site. So my last point is that design does not end once construction starts. It's your job site too. Your firm's sign might be on the gate. You want to be proud of your site and do everything you can to make it look nice. And if you have poor erosion planning, you're going to have more reviews with the city or county, and more iterations. So it's going to waste time and money. And if you have good planning, it also prevents updates during construction. If additional changes are needed, these plans can come unexpectedly. And if construction has already started and the contractor needs some additional engineering or additional plans, they always want a short turnaround because they've already started work and they're all waiting on you. So it's nice to do these preemptive planning so that you don't have to do this frantic scramble during construction. So here's me, here's my email. Feel free to email me if you have any questions. Even though we're happy to answer questions now if they come up later. And also shout out to the Department of Ecology. This project was funded through a grant, so thank you to Ecology for their Stormwater Financial Assistance Program. Thank you. Have a nice day.